Welcome back to our news bulletin. Pakistan's Foreign Office summoned Indian Charge d'Affaires Gaurav Ahluwalia to register Islamabad's protest over unprovoked ceasefire violations along the line of control. Earlier, the Pakistan Army said a woman was martyred in Indian firing in Jandrod and Korehta sectors. The military's media wing said an 8-year-old girl was also wounded in the firing. In a statement, the Foreign Office said Indian actions are a threat to regional peace and stability. This year, India has committed 882 ceasefire violations. At least 52 people were martyred and 261 wounded in over 3,300 ceasefire violations by Indian forces along the line of control in 2019 alone. This is the highest number of ceasefire violations by Indian forces since 2015. Now, for more on Indian aggression across the LOC, we have Air Vice Marshal retired Shehzad Chaudhry. Thank you for your time. Now, Mr. Chaudhry, why is New Delhi resorting to military action against Pakistan with it struggling to manage the COVID-19 pandemic while also facing economic issues and religious unrest at home?
Obviously, India has a lot of problem at home. I mean, for a long time now, we've understood that there's a reaction to Narendra Modi's policies. We've seen that. We've seen the agitation that has come about in the entire country, especially from the Muslim population of India, how they've been marginalized, how they've been deregistered and disenfranchised from the whole process. They're not even being considered as citizens of India. And we know that, and that is what has actually raised the tempers within India. And Narendra Modi was finding it very difficult to satisfy this agitated sentiment. So therefore, there was a possibility that he could actually do something silly on the borders. And we've seen that reaction from him and from his army and from his military as he's activated the LOC on a much greater frequency than ever before. And just to apprise your viewers, in fact, ever since the BJP government has come in, every year the LOC violations increase double the number of the preceding year. And therefore, similarly, that impacts and hits the population, the innocent civilian population that lives along the LOC. The number of deaths are in tens and 50, 60, 70. The injured are many times more. And unfortunately, that includes a large number of the elderly, women, and minor children. So that is what India is resorting to. Also, I feel that they want to divert attention from their own problems within. And therefore, they find it easy to apply pressure on Pakistan. Pakistani army, of course, as we are well aware, is fully involved into fighting COVID, assisting the government within Pakistan. And they want to distract that effort as well from the Pakistani army by activating the border and the LOC, as you just said, and as well as the fact that perhaps there could be a hand in how things are developing on the western border. So we find that there is an element to distract the Pakistani military from its basic function of fighting COVID. At the same time, disabling a sentiment that can question within India Narendra Modi's government about his failure in dealing with the same threat there. And both of our countries are the most populated countries in South Asia. Unfortunately, rather than cooperating on finding ways and means to fight COVID and finding peace and enabling each other to be able to focus on inner problems, India, we've seen, has been extremely belligerent and aggressive in its stance, and that keeps the LOC very, very active.
Now, Mr. Chaudhry, you've rightfully said that BJP has activated activity across the LOC to a higher frequency this time around. Now, as the Indian state and society become more saffronized, what kind of national security challenges should Pakistan expect in the future?
Well, you've seen a more belligerent India, like you just said, and you've seen an India that is willing to perhaps make some adventurous moves. I hope not. But if you really can't tell what BJP is thinking about, and there's a RSS manifesto that it brings along, and which means that the entire society in India is no more a secular country. It's a Hindutva pursuing strategy and notion there. So when you have this kind of a feeling, you really don't know what they might do. Pakistan has to keep its guards up and make sure that we're never surprised and we're able to respond to any Indian adventure across the border, across the LOC, anywhere that the Indians might like to sort of try. And the reason is very simple. In trying to, grab Kashmir, in trying to marginalize the Indian Muslim population, in an attempt to make India Hindu again and give it the Hindu color, etc., etc. Modi can go to any length. And so therefore, in that sense, we have a very difficult neighbor. We have a very difficult person at the head of India at this today. And therefore, Pakistan must keep its guard up and be very careful with what India tends to apply or bring over to Pakistan in terms of a challenge.
India is no more a secular country. This was Air Vice Marshal retired Shehzad Chaudhry talking to us about Indian aggression across the LOC. Thank you for your time. Now, in a related development, Indian forces have martyred 7 more civilians in Kulgam district of occupied Kashmir. The occupation forces have martyred 16 Kashmiris over the past 6 days. The troops martyred 3 civilians during a cordon and search operation in Kazigund area of the district today. They targeted 4 civilians at Asthal village last night. The Indian troops have martyred 25 Kashmiris this month only. The occupied valley is reeling under New Delhi's crushing curfew and communications blackout for the past 266 days. Kuwait has condemned the rising number of ethnic attacks against Muslims in India. In a statement, the Council of Ministers appealed to the OIC and the international community to intervene.
Violence against Muslims is surging in India ever since Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to power in 2014. The revocation of occupied Kashmir special status and the new citizenship law are among the most outrageously destructive steps taken by the BJP government. Now Muslims are being victimized again, with New Delhi using them as scapegoats for the coronavirus outbreak. In the Indian capital, police booked a leader of a Muslim seminary under culpable homicide just for arranging a gathering. Earlier, Princess of the UAE Hind Al Qasimi called out an Indian expat over his Islamophobic posts on social media. Taking to Twitter, she said anyone being openly racist will not be allowed to stay in the UAE. The US Commission on International Religious Freedom has expressed concern over religious segregation in India during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Now, in news on COVID-19, we go to Pakistan, where 605 more people have been infected by the new coronavirus over the past 24 hours, taking the country's tally to over 13,300. The Health Ministry says 12 new deaths have been reported overnight, raising the death toll to 281. It said 78 patients are in a critical condition, while more than 3,000 patients have recovered. The ministry said nearly 6,400 tests have been conducted since yesterday, taking the total number to almost 151,000 across the country. Meanwhile, Prime Minister's health advisor Dr. Zafar Mirza says the National Disaster Management is providing PPEs to all doctors in Pakistan. Talking to media, he said all details regarding the provision of equipment are available at the supply section of NDMA website. The daily death toll from the new coronavirus in the US has dropped to under 1,200 as most states prepare to lift restrictions. Meanwhile, 330 more people have died in Spain, with more than 23,000 dead overall. Here in Pakistan, 12 more people have succumbed to COVID-19, raising the death toll to 281 with over 13,000 infections. The global death toll from the new coronavirus has crossed 206,000 with over 2.9 million people infected. Further details in this report.
Countries around the world are moving to ease coronavirus-related social restrictions as the number of new cases and deaths appear to slow. But medics and experts fear lifting the curbs too soon can result in a resurgence of COVID-19 cases. In the US, the states of Colorado, Mississippi, Minnesota, Montana, and Tennessee will join others to reopen economies. Meanwhile, Britain too is witnessing a definite downward trend in the number of new infections.
You can see that the benefit of social distancing is beginning to be reflected in the number of new cases determined by testing. We are not seeing increases in that. We are seeing a fairly stable number, and that, of course, is also on the backdrop of an increased number of tests becoming available.
In New Zealand, the parliament and courts will reopen and about 400,000 people are expected to return to work under strict conditions. Italy says it will also ease the strict lockdown imposed 7 weeks earlier after the country recorded its lowest one-day toll since March. Meanwhile, life in Spain is finally stumbling back onto its feet after 6 weeks of lockdown.
We appreciate being able to go out because staying home, it was getting very boring. Even though we have the PlayStation and we can talk to our friends on WhatsApp and video calls, it is good to be able to go out and have some fresh air because we were feeling a bit overwhelmed at home.
Iran plans to open mosques in parts of the country that have been consistently free of the coronavirus outbreak. Meanwhile, Singapore, which has one of Asia's smallest populations, is emerging with the highest number of infections in the region.
UK's Prime Minister Boris Johnson says there are no plans to lift the lockdown in the country. Johnson made the announcement in his maiden public speech at 10 Downing Street as he returned to work after recovering from COVID-19. Johnson said he'd recognize the urgency of lifting social restrictions, but warned that this is the moment of maximum risk. He said the people must recognize the risk of a second spike because that will mean not only a new wave of death and disease, but also an economic disaster. The British Prime Minister said the government will outline plans for easing curbs in the coming days, but warned that difficult judgments will be required. Johnson also said the UK is on the brink of achieving the first great mission to prevent National Health Service from being overwhelmed.
And so I know it is tough, and I want to get this economy moving as fast as I can, but I refuse to throw away all the effort and the sacrifice of the British people and to risk a second major outbreak and huge loss of life and the overwhelming of the NHS.
The most stringent lockdown in peacetime history has left UK's economy facing possibly the deepest recession in 3 centuries. Now, in another news, the Afghan government says it is set to release thousands of prisoners. The decision was taken in a meeting chaired by President Ghani and Vice President Mohammad Sarwar Danish. In a statement, President spokesperson Sadiq Siddiqui said the step is being taken on an anniversary of Afghan victory over invasion of the former Soviet Union. The President's Office said Director General of Prisons of Afghanistan will share the details of this decision. Meanwhile, the release of prisoners between Taliban and government remains an issue of conflict after Doha peace deal. The United Nations says over 500 civilians, including more than 150 children, were killed in Afghanistan in the first quarter of 2020. A UN assistance mission to Afghanistan report noted the escalation in violence following the peace deal signed between the US and the Taliban. The report said 760 people were injured in the country during the first 3 months of the year. UNAMA says 282 civilians were killed by anti-government agents, out of which it attributed 39% to the Taliban, 13% to ISIS, and the remainder to undetermined militant groups. UNAMA head Deborah Lyons called on all parties to agree on a ceasefire and focus efforts on fighting the common enemy, COVID-19. The Arab League says it will convene an urgent meeting this week to galvanize opposition to Israeli annexation plans. The extraordinary meeting is scheduled for Thursday at the request of the Palestinian leadership. The meeting will bring together Arab foreign ministers via video conference due to the global coronavirus pandemic. The League's deputy secretary said the ministers will discuss the provision of political, legal, and financial support to the Palestinian leadership to enable it to confront Israel's plans to annex the territory. This comes after the Israeli leadership signed a deal to form a unity government. The arrangement could accelerate Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plans to annex parts of the West Bank in the coming months. The Saudi-led coalition in Yemen has released a Houthi tanker vessel carrying 12,000 tons of diesel fuel after 42 days. In a statement, the Houthis said this vessel is one of the 20 ships seized by coalition forces. The rebels say these ships carry oil and food and were allowed to operate by the UN. They accuse this coalition of violating the Stockholm Agreement over the port city Hodeidah with over 100 artillery shells overnight. Despite the accusation, the coalition has not yet issued a statement on the matter. The coalition accused the Houthis of making the mobility of ships and humanitarian work inoperable in the region. The UAE says it stands against Yemen's southern separatist declaration of self-rule. The Emirati Minister of State for Foreign Affairs called for the implementation of a peace deal agreed on in Riyadh last year. He also urged the Southern Transition Council to fully implement a peace deal agreed last year in Riyadh. The UAE backs the southern separatists who have declared a state of emergency in the southern governorates. Meanwhile, the Saudi-led coalition called for an end to the escalation in Yemen. In a statement, it said any steps that contradict the Riyadh agreement should be cancelled. In Syria, 3 civilians have been killed by Israeli airstrikes in the southern countryside of the capital, Damascus. The attack marks the second airstrike in Syria by Israel over the past week. State media says 3 others, including a child, were wounded in the attack. Damascus says its air defenses shot down most of the missiles shot by Israeli warplanes from over Lebanese airspace, but some of the hostile missiles' shrapnel fell in the populated area. While Tel Aviv says it has been behind a series of airstrikes mainly targeting Iranian and Hezbollah forces in Syria, it did not comment on today's airstrike. The United States has renewed a waiver for Iraq to continue importing electricity from neighboring Iran. The waiver has been renewed for a shorter period of 30 days this time compared to previous periods of up to 120 days. The U.S. State Department said the move was meant to support formation of a credible government in Baghdad. The department said once the government is in place, the secretary will reassess whether to renew the waiver and for how long. It said Washington looks forward to resuming cooperation with Baghdad and reduce its dependence on unreliable Iranian energy imports. The department said the fresh waiver for Iraq will expire on May 26th. Welcome back. Russia has accused the US of double standards and hypocrisy for condemning Iran's satellite launch. Last week, Iran's Revolutionary Guard successfully launched the country's first military satellite. Russia's permanent representative to UN, Mikhail Olavno, said the US is misinterpreting UNSC Resolution 2231 to accuse Iran. The envoy said Washington is attempting to build on a resolution which it undermines by all possible means. Earlier, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said the US is deeply troubled over the satellite launch. Pompeo alleged that Tehran's secret space program advances technologies used in nuclear weapons delivery systems. In U.S. presidential elections, House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi has endorsed Joe Biden for president. She now joins a list of top Democrats who have recently thrown their support behind the former vice president. In a video statement, Pelosi cited Biden's experience in government as evidence of his leadership qualities. She said Biden is well positioned to lead the country amid the ongoing coronavirus outbreak. The endorsement comes at an opportune time for Biden, who has struggled to maintain a high profile during the pandemic. Besides current and past Democratic leaders, Biden has also been endorsed by Washington State Governor Jay Inslee. Earlier this month, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and former President Barack Obama also threw their weight behind Biden. The second part of the U.S. extradition case against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange will not go ahead as planned next month. A UK judge has decided it will not be possible to hold the hearing amid the lockdown in the country. Assange's legal team argued that they had been unable to speak to their client because of COVID-19 lockdown, while the lawyers acting for the United States also agreed it would be unsafe to continue. Judge Vanessa Barrister agreed that hearings could not take place if lawyers were unable to appear in person in the courtroom. The case has been adjourned until May 4th in order to fix a new date. Health authorities in 3 GCC countries have reported new cases and related deaths from the novel coronavirus. More in this report.
Saudi Arabia has announced 1,289 new cases, taking the kingdom's tally to nearly 19,000. Most cases were reported in Jeddah and Makkah, with 294 and 218 infections respectively. The health ministry also announced 5 new deaths, increasing the fatalities to 144. Oman confirmed 51 new cases of COVID-19, taking infections toll to 2,049. Bahrain's health ministry recorded 24 cases, pushing the total to 2,647. So far, the tiny Gulf country has reported 8 deaths and almost 1,200 recoveries.
The number of COVID-19 cases in Africa has risen to nearly 32,000, whereas recoveries have reached 9,500. In an update, Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said the death toll now stands at 1,423. Of the 5 geographic regions of the continent, North Africa has the highest toll, followed by West, Southern, East and Central Africa. Egypt and South Africa both registered over 4,500 cases. In terms of the death toll, Egypt has 317 in sharp contrast to South Africa's 87. In North Africa, Algeria recorded the highest death toll at 425, while Morocco has registered 161 deaths so far. The tiny nation of Djibouti is the hardest hit in the East Africa with 1,000 cases and 2 deaths, while Somalia recorded 436 cases and 23 deaths. In the efforts to develop a vaccine to end the COVID-19 pandemic, governments, charities and big pharma firms are pouring in billions of dollars. Chief Scientific Officer at Johnson & Johnson, Paul Stoffels, says the crisis is so big that everyone will have to take maximum risk to put this disease to a stop. Johnson & Johnson has partnered with the US government on a $1 billion investment to speed up development of its still unproven vaccine. Stoffel says a lot of desperate hopes are pinned on their success. Meanwhile, UK Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab says it is unrealistic to expect a vaccine for COVID-19 before the end of 2020.
Vaccine wouldn't realistically come into play until the end of the year. The testing, tracking and tracing, I think, has a better medium-term prognosis. There's also therapeutics and drugs. And the reason that's important is if we can actually treat coronavirus and take away the fatalities, if it became something more akin to seasonal flu, that would also give us more flexibility in the next transition phase.
In China, Center for Disease Control and Prevention says an emergency vaccine may be available by September as clinical trials continue. Now we go to the UK, where calls to a national domestic abuse helpline have jumped by 49% and killings have doubled amid the coronavirus lockdown. In a report, MPs called on the government to devise a strategy on domestic abuse during the pandemic. Researchers at the Counting Dead Women Project told MPs that 14 women and 2 children were killed in the first 3 weeks of lockdown. This is the largest number of killings in a similar period for 11 years and more than double the average rate. MPs also said safe spaces where victims can seek help should be rolled out to supermarkets and other shops. The Home Office said it was increasing funding to support helplines and online services. The United Kingdom has evacuated at least 300 of its citizens from India's northern Punjab state. The evacuations come amid the ongoing lockdown imposed to tackle the coronavirus. Around 307 British nationals of Indian origin were taken in a special flight from northern Amritsar. They were unable to return to the UK after being stuck in India due to the lockdown. India extended its countrywide lockdown until 3rd May, allowing only essential services to function. Experts say that India's poorly funded medical infrastructure will not be able to tackle the pandemic if the numbers rise further. Over 870 people have died due to the virus, and more than 27,000 have been infected in India. India's BJP government is facing criticism nationwide for poor arrangements at hospitals treating COVID-19 patients. The country has reported nearly 28,000 infections and 881 deaths from the new coronavirus so far. Talking to media, the families of patients said the government took infected people with them, understanding their medical history. They said patients have been served inedible food and authorities have not provided any blankets or pillows. They said the hospitals are unhygienic with uncooperative staff, including nurses. The family said after hospitals, the patients are being shifted to quarantine centers where conditions are even worse. More from India, as millions of poor migrant workers have been left in lurch after announcement of lockdown by Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The decision have made them unable to search work or return to their homes in the absence of transportation. Details in this report.
Migrant workers in India are at the mercy of circumstances. The workers fear that they will starve to death even if they survive the pandemic. Some migrant workers, along with their families, have taken shelter in an under-constructed building and are struggling to arrange food.
Once the work resumes, then it will be nice. And if the work does not resume, then we are worried that what will we eat? What will we earn? We have our children with us. If they get ill, who will look after us?
Without work, these workers are struggling for survival.
Our work has stopped for over 1 month. We have no work from March 22. After the lockdown, if the construction resumes, then we might get some work.
Poor sanitation infrastructure, high population and poverty have raised concerns over the Indian government's measures to stop the spread of the coronavirus. In these circumstances, another crisis is looming large as a result of abrupt decision and poor planning.
New York City's Poison Control Center says it has seen a spike in the number of people ingesting household cleaners. It said the problem has worsened after President Donald Trump raised the possibility of using disinfectant inside people's bodies to fight the coronavirus. The center registered 30 cases in an 18-hour period on Sunday. 9 of the cases were related to exposure to Lysol, 10 were due to bleach, and 11 were exposures to other household cleaners. Department of Health and Mental Hygiene spokesman Pedro Franzada has warned New Yorkers against following Trump's advice. China has rejected a European Union report that accuses Beijing of spreading disinformation about the coronavirus outbreak. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Geng Shuang said China is a victim of COVID-19 propaganda instead. At a weekly press briefing, Geng dismissed U.S. accusations that China and the WHO covered up coronavirus data. Earlier, White House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy branded the World Health Organization as the Wuhan Health Organization. President Donald Trump has also halted the human agency's funding, accusing it of bungling its early response to the coronavirus. Chile's government says it will go ahead with a controversial plan to issue certificates to people who have recovered from COVID-19. Deputy Health Minister Paula Daza said the documents will allow people to return to work. This comes despite warnings from the World Health Organization that people who contract coronavirus are not immune from being infected again. It said certificates can inspire false confidence and increase the chances of the infection spreading. But Daza said a person who has had an illness has a lower probability of becoming ill again. She said the certificate will only declare people immune but state that they have recovered and completed a period of isolation. Chile has reported 189 virus-related deaths and more than 13,000 confirmed infections. We're taking a short break, but stay tuned for more news. For our top business story, we look at Wall Street stocks, which are trading higher as investors mull the possibility of reopening the economy after the coronavirus outbreak. Investors are also waiting quarterly earnings reports from marquee companies, including Apple and Microsoft, later this week. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained about 0.75%, while the S&P 500 and Nasdaq Composite indices are trading higher by almost 1%. European stock markets also traded higher over gradual easing of lockdown and resumption of business activity in the region. The stocks in Asia Pacific rose as the Bank of Japan announced its decision to enhance monetary policy easing. Meanwhile, U.S. oil prices plunged more than 25% on storage capacity concerns. The Bank of Japan has expanded its monetary stimulus measures and pledged to buy an unlimited amount of bonds to keep borrowing costs low. The move comes as the government tries to spend its way out of the deepening economic pain from the COVID-19 pandemic. The central bank said it will boost the amount of corporate bonds and commercial debt it buys at $186 billion. The bank said it also aims to buy government bonds without setting an upper limit at an annual pace of nearly $746 billion. The move puts the BOJ in line with other major central banks that have unleashed unprecedented monetary support. In a quarterly economic report issued on Monday, the bank also revised down its growth forecast. For the current fiscal year to March 2021, it now forecasts the economy will shrink by 0.3% to nearly 0.5%. The U.S. unemployment rate is likely to hit 16% or higher in April. A White House advisor said big, thoughtful policies will be needed to rebuild confidence. Speaking in Washington, Kevin Hassett said the next couple of months are going to look terrible. He said the GDP growth will land in negative territory in the second quarter. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said he expected the economy will start improving shortly after the country comes out of lockdown. He said the government will open up the economy in May and June, and it will bounce back from July to September. Now let's look at the weather from around the globe. This is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.